So SpongeBob has failed his driving test millions of times, but why? How? Why does he keep failing it if he's had a million attempts? Shouldn't he learn from his previous mistakes? Well, there might be more to this, so join me as we dive into the license theory. We know that SpongeBob has failed his test hundreds if not thousands of times, but how did it come to this? Well, in Mrs. Puff's debut episode, Boating School, we learned that by that point, SpongeBob has taken the test and failed it a total of 38 times. We also learned that in the same episode that SpongeBob, as a student, is highly educated and passes the oral exam quite quickly. But this could be due to him failing 38 times and memorizing the questions and their answers because he's seen answering the questions before Mrs. Puff even asks them. However, he's no doubt educated as we see in the future episodes like Nautical Novice. However, when it comes to taking the actual driving part of the test, he seems to fail at it to the point where Mrs. Puff doesn't even bother giving him an oral exam after this episode. Every time he's failed, but in this episode it's a little bit different because Patrick is telling SpongeBob exactly what to do in order to pass the test through an earpiece. By his actions, it's clear that at this point, SpongeBob is too nervous to take the test and is all jittery. However, much later in the episode No Free Rides, we see that SpongeBob is no longer nervous while taking the test, but still keeps failing. It's clear that he's gotten over his nervousness, but he still keeps failing. This could be due to two reasons. Either he's a bad student, or Mrs. Puff is a bad teacher. There might be some proof across the events of the show that could show us the type of teacher Mrs. Puff is. Going back to the episode Boating School, we see a green fish at the start of the episode claim that he got his license. But just a few episodes later in the episode Hall Monitor, once again at the start of the episode, we see him sitting in Mrs. Puff's class. If he passed, then why is he back in class? Now there might be one major flaw to this, which is that he sounds nothing like the green fish but just looks like him.
Hey, I just got my license!
This is Puff, I've done it already!
However, remembering the death theory really quickly, which I recommend you should totally go check out, we know that the duplicates didn't show up in Bikini Bottom until season 2, meaning that it has to be him. So why did his voice change, and why is he back in class? Well, one way for him to be forced to retake the class could be that he got into an accident. The idea is a bit like the episode Boating Buddies, in which Squidward gets a ticket and to keep his record clean, he's forced to attend boating school for 1 day. The green fish could have gotten into an accident and been forced to take the class again for legal reasons. His voice change could be due to vocal cord paralysis if he were to suffer from a chest or neck injury, which is completely possible in a car accident. This really makes you think the kind of teacher that Mrs. Puff is, passing a student who comes back a bit later due to a potential crash. Let's not forget that in the episode Boating School, she was willing to let SpongeBob pass despite knowing he was cheating. It's true that she can't stand SpongeBob, but she's willing to take her chances with him being out there, kinda like the episode No Free Rides. While she may not be the most ethical teacher out there, there's one quality about her that is redeeming. She cares about SpongeBob's feelings. In the episode Hall Monitor, she felt bad for SpongeBob for not being able to be Hall Monitor for the day and let him take the uniform home just so he could feel better about himself. While at the end of the episode she does end up going to jail because of him, even in the episode Doing Time, she protects the feelings of SpongeBob by not telling him that he's the reason she wants to stay in prison. But this all starts to fade away by the episode Demolition Doofus, where she tries to get SpongeBob killed due to his impact on her life. Going back to Mrs. Puff and her questionable ethics, there is a very interesting part in the episode No Free Rides that no one seems to point out. At the start of the episode, SpongeBob hits the cameraman and Mrs. Puff mentions that the test is over and he has a total of negative 224 points.
Minus 20 more points.
How many does that leave me with?
Negative 224.
We later learn that he needs 600 to get a license. But SpongeBob, still believing in himself, thinks that he can make up the points despite the test being over. He then proceeds to crash the boat and land it upside down. We then get the iconic scene where Mrs. Puff reveals that SpongeBob got 6 out of 600 points, meaning he got 1%. And that's great and all, but how on earth did she give him 230 points? All we see him do is a flip and crash the boat. How is that worth 230 points? This really puts the qualifications of Mrs. Puff into question. In the episode Boat Smarts, we see Mrs. Puff show us that she's an accredited driving instructor, meaning that she went through school to become a teacher. This allows her to legally teach other students. We even see that her license is up for renewal in the episode Mrs. Puff, You're Fired. So if she has all the legal requirements to teach, then how is she able to do such things without getting in trouble? But the problems with Mrs. Puff actually don't end here. In the episode Mrs. Puff, You're Fired, we see the replacement teacher bought for Mrs. Puff once SpongeBob fails his test for the 1,258,057th time. He seems to have a more hands-on approach with teaching his students. He forces SpongeBob to go through the most grueling driving course ever devised, several times. After several weeks of training, SpongeBob trains by crawling the course, going sideways, blindfolded, and more. When he takes the test, they run into the issue with SpongeBob wanting to keep the blindfold on while driving and it being illegal. Had it not been for this issue, he probably would have passed the test. But one notable thing in this episode is that when the new teacher asks him if he's ready for his training, he immediately jumps into the boat and gets ready for his test, not knowing what course the teacher wanted him to go through. This is a sign that when Mrs. Puff was his teacher and she taught him like everyone else, only verbally. It means that she never gave SpongeBob the practical knowledge that he lacks when taking the test. She never taught him how to actually drive a boat practically because she only verbally taught him. This is why whenever we see SpongeBob drive, he's always taking the test instead of practicing. It's clear that SpongeBob, as a student, hasn't gotten the practical knowledge he needs from his teacher, and that's the reason he keeps failing. He's really book smart and knows what to do while driving, but he doesn't know how to apply himself as he's had no training before. It's also clear that Mrs. Puff is not a good fit as a teacher for SpongeBob, but that doesn't mean she's a bad teacher by any means. We learn in the episode Mrs. Puff, You're Fired that SpongeBob is the only person to ever fail her class. All she's trying to do is pass SpongeBob through any legal loophole so she can finally get rid of him and never have to teach him again. But there's just one teeny tiny question. Why is SpongeBob still allowed to attempt the boating test despite failing over 1 million times? There should be some general rule that if you fail at something as dangerous as driving over 1 million times, you should be blacklisted from even attempting to take a driving test. However, for whatever reason, SpongeBob can still go every week to attempt a driving test. Even the people of Bikini Bottom don't want SpongeBob to drive, as the entire episode Boat Smarts is brought to us by...
This driving safety film is brought to you by citizens of Bikini Bottom, united to keep SpongeBob SquarePants off the road and out of boats altogether.
However, despite the public not wanting him on the road, there's two things that still allow him to take the test as many times as he wants: the law and the Boating Teachers Accreditation Bureau. The Boating Teachers Accreditation Bureau is pretty much what it claims to be. In the episode Mrs. Puff, You're Fired, a representative named Mr. Fitz shows up to warn Mrs. Puff about SpongeBob failing and ends up blaming her for his failure and firing her. He and the Bureau still clearly have SpongeBob's back when it comes to driving, and even by the end of the episode when SpongeBob yet again fails with the new teacher. The other one is the law. In real life, in most places, there's no limit as to how many times you can fail a test. You might have to repay fees, but other than that, you can fail as much as you want. Even though the people want him off the streets, Mrs. Puff is still not allowed to no longer let SpongeBob take the tests because of the law. So it's clear that SpongeBob can take his test whenever he wants, but if SpongeBob keeps failing, how on earth did Patrick pass the test on his very first try? In the episode Driven to Tears, the episode opens with SpongeBob, once again, failing his driving test. This would be the 58th time he's failed the test. Now this time, Patrick actually showed up to cheer his friend and give him confidence. After seeing SpongeBob come out of the school crying, Patrick came to the conclusion that the test was rigged and decided to go give it himself. With no appointment, Patrick is able to give his test. This is a little suspicious, but Patrick did attend boating school for one day in the episode New Student Starfish. Also, Mrs. Puff knows him from the episode Doing Time, so she might have some records which still allow him to give the test. Anyways, Patrick ends up passing the test with a perfect score. An idiot like Patrick is able to get a perfect score. How? Patrick has no experience in driving compared to SpongeBob. So how did he pass? Well, going back to the episode Boating School, it was Patrick who was feeding the answers to SpongeBob when he was taking his test. We could assume that for whatever reason, Patrick is naturally good at driving and knows how to do it. But this information doesn't really matter after Patrick does this. While Patrick does have a license and can legally drive, it seems SpongeBob is more educated compared to him when it comes to driving a boat, as Patrick goes past many red lights and causes accidents, which means that Patrick isn't qualified to drive after all. So now we have two examples of Mrs. Puff passing a student that was not qualified to drive a boat. The first one is the green fish, who's seen getting his license in the episode Boating School, but is then seen in class again in the episode Hall Monitor, and the second one being Patrick, who of course, by the way, got 100%. How did Mrs. Puff give them their licenses despite them clearly not being ready to drive? And whatever she did for them, why can't she do it for SpongeBob just to get rid of him? It's clear that she hates him and tries to kill him just so she doesn't have to teach him. Why hasn't she pulled the same legal loophole that she uses for other students to get rid of SpongeBob? So let's go to the first question. How did the green fish and Patrick pass the class despite being unqualified to drive? It's obvious that Mrs. Puff has something going on for her to only have one student who's ever failed. Even the best teacher the Boating Teachers Accreditation Bureau had to offer passed every student who took the class, but it was mostly because most of the people who took the class ended up dropping it or not surviving. What motive could Mrs. Puff have for doing something so shady to pass her students despite them not being ready? Is it to maintain her clean record of passing all but one student? Or is it for business reasons? In the episode SpongeBob Long Pants, we learned that there are other boating schools within Bikini Bottom when SpongeBob gets long pants and decides to try a different boating school to see if he could pass. We even get a funny moment of Mrs. Puff being scared of SpongeBob getting his license despite her not even knowing it. Anyways, since there's a clear competition from other boating schools, isn't it possible that she could be trying to pass every student possible so that her boating school has good reviews and she gets the reputation of a good teacher? This would increase her business as more and more people would come for her services due to her reputation. This would lead to her earning a lot more money. It's clear that she has a motive to pass every student she comes across to earn more money, but how does she do it? It's obviously illegal to pass any student that doesn't pass their driving test, so how does she get away with it? Well, when I mentioned that there's only 2 examples of Mrs. Puff passing a student, I lied. There's actually 3 examples. In the episode No Free Rides, after SpongeBob yet again fails his driving test, Mrs. Puff gets fed up with him and decides to give him extra credit for writing a 10-word essay, which would give her the power to pass him. The essay ends up being only 7 words long, and all the words are written by Mrs. Puff, but she still ends up passing him. However, by the end of the episode, Mrs. Puff ends up revoking his license because if people found out that she passed SpongeBob and SpongeBob ended up crashing or destroying the town, not only would she lose her business but also go to jail. In the episode The Krabby Chronicle, we see what a simple fake news headline did to Mrs. Puff's business. It's clear that if she allowed SpongeBob to be out in the wild with a license, she would have lost her business and gone to jail the very next day. Now, while this method didn't work with SpongeBob as everyone in the city is aware of his reputation, it can work with everyone else. Those who are genuinely good at driving, like Squidward, passed the test through a legal way. However, those who can't drive are giving meaningless extra credit, like SpongeBob, and Mrs. Puff writes in her books that they passed. This gives her a better reputation and allows her business to flourish no matter what happens to her. This could be the reason as to why she still has business after every time she goes to jail. This method is most likely illegal, but she's able to do it as she is the teacher and has the authority. She just simply tells the boating teacher's accreditation bureau that the student passed, and they can't really check if she's telling the truth, so they're forced to trust her. But is Mrs. Puff even capable of doing this? Sure, SpongeBob drives her crazy, but does that really mean that she has to do this? Well, not only have we seen her pass SpongeBob through meaningless extra credit, but she's also tried to give him 230 points despite him breaking every rule possible. It shows she's trying to do whatever it takes to pass him so she never has to see him again. She's clearly doing some shady activity just so she can pass him and get rid of him. At one point, she must have realized that she didn't want another student like SpongeBob. She didn't want another student who kept failing her class. Not only would it hurt her reputation, but also drive her crazy. So she decided to try this method on anyone who failed on their first attempt. While she can't do this to SpongeBob due to his reputation, she isn't forced to deal with one more SpongeBob, which for her is a win. But we still haven't answered the main question, the whole reason you clicked on this video. Why does SpongeBob keep failing his driving test? So while Mrs. Puff is doing her own side illegal business, it still begs the question as to why SpongeBob keeps failing his test. He's literally taken the test millions of times. We've seen him memorize the questions so he can answer them really quickly in the episode Boating School, to the point where Mrs. Puff has stopped giving him the oral test altogether. What's stopping him from practicing and getting good at driving? One thing for sure, which is that it's not the fault of any person, as pretty much everyone in the show wants SpongeBob to pass. Mrs. Puff, SpongeBob himself, and literally every fish in Bikini Bottom wants SpongeBob to learn how to drive and pass the test so he no longer remains a threat to Bikini Bottom. So what could it be? It can't be SpongeBob himself, as he's overcome his previous fear of driving, as we see in the episode No Free Rides. But what about his mental state? I mean, we know that SpongeBob has somehow taken the test over 1 million times. Surely that's going to hurt his self-confidence in his ability to drive. Even if SpongeBob doesn't show it, it's clear that he wants a license really badly, and so do his parents. We even learn that it's hurting him inside in the episode Driven to Tears, when at the start of the episode, he once again fails his test. We even see in the episode Boating School that the idea of failing his test keeps him up at night. But there's also one more sign of mental illness within SpongeBob. Whenever SpongeBob is taking the test, there's always this running gag of SpongeBob saying "floor it" before everything goes south.
Floor it?
No!
Then what? Floor it?
No!
Okay, floor it!
Could this be a sign of PTSD? I mean, he's taken the test so many times and failed it to the point where you can't even blame him for having PTSD. The truth is that SpongeBob as a student is extremely brilliant and talented when it comes to knowing rules or history of boating, but when it comes to practical knowledge, he seems to fail at every step due to PTSD and the toll on his mental health due to millions of failures.